What would you do if the very seat you paid for, the space you rightfully belonged in, was denied to you because of the color of your skin? On an ordinary flight bound for Los Angeles, a calm but powerful man named Jordan Maxwell, a CEO known to very few in that cabin, was told he didn't belong in seat 1A. Cameras were rolling. Passengers whispered. A teenager's live stream began to climb into the tens of thousands. What began as humiliation in a narrow aisle soon spiraled into a confrontation that threatened to shut down an entire airline. How can one quiet voice turn a whole industry upside down? How can the dignity of one man force corporations to rewrite their rules? And what happens when the world becomes witness to injustice in real time? This is not just the story of a flight delayed. It is the story of power, prejudice, and a decision that would ripple far beyond the cabin walls. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you may be asking yourself, what would I have done in that seat? If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Sky Flight 972 glowed with a muted amber light, soft against the curved panels of the aircraft walls. It was late afternoon at JFK, the kind of hour where shadows stretched across the tarmac, and every reflection on the window looked heavier than it should. Passengers were still settling in, some tapping emails, others already sipping on sparkling water or champagne poured into tall, slender glasses. In seat 1A sat Jordan Maxwell. At first glance, he looked like any well-dressed businessman returning from another long week of meetings. Navy suit, crisp shirt, Italian leather shoes, polished to a faint shine. A platinum watch peeked from his cuff, but he wore it without ostentation. To him, time had always been a measure of discipline, not display. Jordan leaned back, stretching his tall frame into the wide seat. His laptop glowed with muted graphs and columns of numbers. They weren't for show. They were quarterly forecasts for Stratus Systems, the technology backbone that quietly powered a dozen of the world's largest airlines. He had written some of the original code himself years earlier, back when he was a graduate student trying to convince skeptical investors that infrastructure was not boring but essential. Now his company handled millions of bookings daily. He was used to living in two worlds at once: the visible one, where he was just another passenger, and the hidden one, where he held levers capable of stopping a global network in seconds. Most people didn't know his name. He preferred it that way. The calm was interrupted by the click of heels against the cabin carpet. A shadow crossed the edge of his screen. Jordan looked up slowly. Standing over him was a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled tightly back, uniform pressed to regulation perfection. Her name tag gleamed under the overhead lights. Clara Jensen. Her posture was confident, arms crossed in the stance of someone used to control. She gave a practiced smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice firm, but carrying a sweetness just thin enough to disguise the steel beneath. "This seat. I believe there's been a mistake. May I see your boarding pass?" Jordan blinked once, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He handed her the slip of paper he had already scanned twice at the gate. First class. 1A. Clara held the ticket to the light, tilting it as if checking for invisible ink. She pressed her lips together, a small line of doubt carved into her expression. Passengers nearby began to glance over. In 1C, a salt-and-pepper-haired businessman adjusted his tie, his mouth curling into what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. In 1F, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a leather purse sat very still, as if she had seen this kind of scene before. From the second row, a faint red light blinked. A teenager, phone lifted discreetly but deliberately, whispered into her live stream. "You guys seeing this? He's showing his ticket. but she's still questioning him. This is crazy. Her name was Lily Tran, 17 years old, flying with her cousin to visit colleges in California. Her live stream viewers ticked upward 243, 361, 512. Jordan remained still. His calmness wasn't passive, it was practiced. Years of being doubted had carved a reservoir of patience in him, but beneath it, a current of fire still moved. "Are you certain this ticket is yours?" Clara asked, this time louder, drawing more attention. She scanned his suit, his shoes, his watch. Passengers in this cabin usually present differently. Jordan met her gaze steadily. "It's mine." His voice was low, deep, carrying no edge of panic. Clara pursed her lips again, then turned slightly as if to call for backup. A younger attendant hovered a few feet away, uncertain. The mood in the cabin began to shift. Some passengers frowned, others looked down at their screens as if pretending not to notice. But the air itself thickened. Jordan exhaled through his nose, long and quiet. For a moment, he was no longer in 1A. He was 8 years old, standing at the gates of a country club in New Jersey. His father's associate had crouched down to his eye level and said, "There are rules. Some places aren't for everyone." He remembered the smell of chlorine, the bright sunlight on the pool beyond the fence, and the cold ache of being told he didn't belong. That ache had never left him. It had only taught him how to carry himself when the moment came again. He blinked, and the memory receded. The cabin came back into focus. The hum of engines, the soft click of champagne glasses, Clara still standing, expectant. Jordan spoke evenly. "Do you need to see it again?" She gave a thin smile. "Perhaps once more, just to be sure." Lily whispered again into her phone, eyes wide. "Third time she's asked. He already showed it 3 times. People in the chat are saying this is discrimination. Hashtag seat while black is starting." Her viewer count jumped 1,200, 1,600, $2,000. In 2B, a young mother shifted uncomfortably, cradling her toddler. She leaned toward her neighbor and murmured, "This doesn't feel right." Her neighbor, the man in 1C, scoffed audibly. Finally, someone enforcing the rules. Jordan caught the words, but his expression didn't change. Inside, though, his mind was sharpening. He thought about the time. 3:45 p.m. Departure, scheduled for 4:10. He thought about the systems humming in Stratus's servers, 1,000 miles away, but one command from his fingertips. He thought about choices: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to strike. For now, he chose silence. He leaned back in his seat, folding his hands over his laptop. He let Clara's doubt hang in the air like a test. He had faced tests before. The intercom hissed softly, the captain's voice announcing final preparations. Somewhere in the background, the aircraft door closed with a thud that felt heavier than usual. In that sealed cabin, the story had only just begun. The hum of the engines grew steadier as the cabin crew prepared for departure. Passengers in first class were now fully seated, yet a tension lingered in the air. A tension that had nothing to do with weather delays or air traffic control. It came from the way Clara Jensen still stood in front of seat 1A, arms crossed, holding the boarding pass as though it were a counterfeit bill waiting to be exposed. Jordan Maxwell remained calm, his eyes on her face. He had been through this before, not here on an airplane, but in countless settings where the unspoken suggestion was the same. You do not belong. He had learned to let silence work for him, to stretch into the spaces where others grew uncomfortable. But Clara did not look uncomfortable. She looked convinced. She tapped her pen against the edge of the boarding pass, then glanced toward the front galley. "David," she called. A tall man with close-cropped hair emerged from the galley. His uniform jacket bore the stripes of authority. David Ortiz, the purser, someone who in theory carried responsibility for the entire cabin. He approached with measured steps, already wearing the neutral mask of judgment. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "This gentleman insists that seat 1A is his," Clara said, her tone laced with implication. "But I'm not convinced." David took the boarding pass, studying it with slow deliberation. Jordan noticed how he did not address him directly at first, but instead spoke to Clara as though she were the only participant in the conversation. Finally, he looked at Jordan. "Sir, may I see a photo ID to match this ticket?" Jordan reached into his wallet without protest. He produced his driver's license, slid it across the table. David held it to the light, compared it with the ticket, then back to Jordan's face. "Where did you purchase this ticket?" he asked, voice neutral, but loaded. "Directly," Jordan replied, his tone calm. "Through the airline website." David gave a small nod, yet he did not hand back the ticket or ID. Instead, he tilted his head toward Clara, a silent exchange passing between them. Clara folded her arms tighter. The elderly woman in 1F, Evelyn Hart, adjusted her purse and leaned forward slightly. Her eyes were sharp, watchful. She had lived long enough to recognize when procedure was being used as camouflage for prejudice. Meanwhile, Lily Tran's phone continued streaming. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. "Viewers, this is part 2. They've called another attendant now. They're asking for ID even after he showed his ticket 3 times. You can see it right there on the screen. He's calm, not raising his voice, but they just keep pushing." Her chat feed scrolled rapidly. Words like racism, discrimination, seat, while black flooded the screen. Viewer count 2,700, then 3,200, then 4,000. Jordan took a slow breath. He knew he could end this now. One phone call, one command, and the airline's digital infrastructure would freeze like ice in an instant. But his instinct told him to wait. Timing was everything. Sometimes you had to let injustice play itself out long enough for everyone to see it clearly. David returned the license reluctantly. "I'll need to verify this with our system." "I've already been verified," Jordan said quietly. "Twice at the gate, once here. How many times does proof stop being proof?" David did not answer. He turned slightly as if ready to retreat to the galley. Clara remained, still watching Jordan as if waiting for a mistake. From behind, a passenger in 3B leaned forward. "Can you hurry up?" she said impatiently. "I have a connection to make." Others murmured in agreement, not all. In 2B, the young mother spoke again. "He's done nothing wrong. Why are you holding up the flight?" The man in 1C snapped back. "Mind your own business. We're all waiting because he can't follow rules." Jordan kept his gaze forward, refusing to bite at the bait. But inside his mind the storm began to gather. Memories of every boardroom where he had been underestimated. Every investor pitch where his ideas were second-guessed until they saw his numbers. Every hotel desk clerk who had asked him twice if the platinum card was really his. He breathed once, slow, and let it pass. Clara finally spoke again, her voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard by several passengers. "Rules are rules. If the system flags something unusual, we must investigate." Jordan turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. And what was unusual here? She hesitated, lips pressed together. "I'll let my supervisor explain." David returned, handing back the ticket. His expression was professional, yet there was an edge of doubt still lingering. "We'll let you sit for now," he said, "but any inconsistency, and you'll be moved." Jordan gave the faintest nod. He knew what this was. They had not admitted fault, only postponed their verdict. Lily whispered into her phone, "You heard that." "Right. They said he can stay for now. like his seat is temporary. This is wild. Viewers are saying call a lawyer. We're trending. Guys, our seat while black is trending number 4 right now. Her eyes widened as the numbers climbed 7,500 viewers, then 9,200. The hum of the engines continued. The captain announced a brief delay for paperwork, his voice calm, masking any awareness of the drama unfolding in first class. Jordan placed his license and ticket back into his wallet. He set the wallet down next to his laptop, fingers resting lightly on the edge. To an outsider, it looked casual. To him, it was a reminder. In that device lay the power to level an entire airline's systems in seconds. He chose not to. Not yet. Instead, he opened a document. The spreadsheet columns glowed faintly against the dim light of the cabin. Numbers, projections, revenue forecasts. They steadied him, gave him something to focus on besides the burning sensation at the back of his mind. He thought about his daughter at college, studying political science because she wanted to change systems from the inside. He thought about his father, who had once told him, justice isn't about revenge. Son, it's about making sure no one else has to go through what you went through. Jordan pressed his lips together. He knew this was more than a seat. It was a test. The question was whether he would let the moment pass as countless others had, or whether he would use it to strike at something deeper. For now, he remained silent. But the silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Evelyn Hart, from her seat in 1F, gave a small nod to herself. She recognized it. She had seen that kind of silence before, during marches, during trials, during moments when dignity was the only armor a person had. She knew what was coming. The cabin returned to its hum. Yet under the surface, pressure was building. Jordan folded his hands, eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the moment when patience would no longer be enough. The cabin should have settled by now. First class usually turned quiet once boarding closed, a sanctuary of calm before the rush of takeoff. But on this flight, calm had fractured. Conversations floated low and uneasy, punctuated by glances toward seat 1A, where Jordan Maxwell sat with unshaken composure. Clara Jensen had retreated a few rows back, whispering with David Ortiz near the galley curtain. Their posture said everything. This was not over. Jordan watched them in the reflection of his laptop screen. Not directly. He had learned long ago that confrontation sometimes drew more attention when you did not meet it head-on. Still, he could feel the ripple of tension spreading through the cabin. The man in 1C checked his watch, exaggerated sighs spilling out as if he had been personally wronged by Jordan's presence. The young mother in 2B rocked her child gently, humming under her breath, her eyes darting toward Jordan every so often with something like solidarity. And Evelyn Hart, the elderly woman in 1F, sat like a sentinel. Her gaze moved from Jordan to Clara and David, then back again. Her purse strap was looped tight around her hand, as if she needed something to grip. But her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, yet firm. "Let him be," she said almost to herself, but loud enough for the row to hear. The man in 1C snapped back. "You don't know the rules, ma'am. They're just doing their job." Evelyn turned her head slowly, her eyes sharper than her years might have suggested. "I've been watching rules used as excuses for 50 years, and I know the difference." The words cut through the cabin. Clara stiffened at the galley entrance. David shifted his weight, but did not turn. Meanwhile, Lily Tran's live stream was exploding. The numbers had jumped past 15,000. Comments flooded the screen, people tagging journalists, calling out the airline by name, demanding accountability. "This is insane," Lily whispered, narrating for her audience. "He has the ticket, The ID, everything. They're still trying to push him out. You're watching this live. People. Atlantic Sky Flight 972. Remember this. Jordan closed his laptop gently, setting it on the side table. His expression remained unreadable. Inside, though, he felt the weight of the moment pressing harder. He thought again of his father's words about justice not being revenge, but prevention. He knew the line he was walking. If he acted too soon, they would call it overreaction. If he waited too long, the harm would deepen. Clara approached again, clipboard in hand this time. Mr. Maxwell, we've reviewed your documents, but we're still seeing inconsistencies. We may have to ask you to move temporarily until we confirm with ground staff. Jordan looked up slowly. His voice was even, but the pause before he spoke carried its own gravity. What inconsistencies? Clara faltered for the briefest second before recovering. Your profile doesn't match the travel history we expected. Passengers in this seat usually... She stopped short, the implication hanging heavy. Usually what? Jordan asked softly. Her jaw tightened. Usually have a different appearance. The words landed like a gavel strike. The air thickened. Someone in row 3 muttered wow under their breath. Evelyn Hart closed her eyes briefly, as if hearing a line she had dreaded but expected. Jordan leaned back slightly, folding his arms. So it is about appearance. Clara flushed. I'm only following procedure. Procedure, Jordan repeated quietly, letting the word linger. Or perception. David Ortiz stepped forward now, clearly aware the conversation was slipping beyond control. His voice was firmer, rehearsed. Sir, if you do not comply, we will have to call airport security.
This flight must depart on time. You are delaying us. A murmur rippled through the cabin. The man in 1C muttered agreement. A passenger further back said loudly, "Just move him already." But the young mother in 2B spoke up, louder this time. He paid for his seat. He belongs here. You can't just decide otherwise. Her words carried a tremor, but they resonated. Several heads turned toward her, surprised by her courage. Jordan's eyes flicked to her briefly, then back to David. He let silence stretch until the only sounds were the faint chime of a phone shutting down and the muffled cry of the baby. Finally he spoke. I will not move. I have paid for this seat, and I will remain here. If you wish to escalate, then do so, but understand the consequences. David narrowed his eyes. Are you threatening the crew? Jordan's voice stayed calm. No, I am reminding you that not every action is without cost. Clara's chin lifted slightly, a flash of triumph as she turned toward the aisle. Officer, she called. The cabin stirred as a tall figure entered. Dark uniform, radio clipped to his shoulder, expression already weary. Marcus Delgado, airport security officer, stepped into first class with the slow tread of someone who had been through these routines too many times. His hand hovered near his belt, not aggressive yet, but a reminder of authority. What's happening here? Marcus asked, his tone flat. Clara spoke quickly, eager. This passenger refuses to comply. He insists on occupying a seat that may not be his. Jordan spoke before Marcus could respond. My ticket, my ID, verified multiple times. They simply do not believe I belong. Marcus looked from one to the other, his brow furrowing. He had seen this scene play out before, though rarely with such tension. He touched his radio, murmured something low. Then he gave Jordan a long, measured look. You have 60 seconds to comply, sir, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of practiced protocol. Or we will escort you off. The cabin gasped as one. Lily's phone trembled in her hand. "You guys heard that, right?" she whispered. 60 seconds. They're threatening to drag him off. This is unreal. Viewers are at 23,000. Keep sharing. Jordan's chest rose once, slow and steady. He glanced around the cabin at Evelyn Hart, who met his gaze with quiet steel, at the young mother in 2B, rocking her child but watching with fierce attention, at Lily, her phone raised like a witness in the digital age. He thought of the contract, Clause 14.2, written years ago into the backbone of every agreement Stratos Systems had with its airline partners, a safeguard not for servers but for people. Any act of proven discrimination at a customer touchpoint constituted material breach, allowing immediate activation of emergency protocols. It was buried deep in legal text, dismissed by executives as symbolic. But Jordan had written it with days like this in mind. His fingers itched for the phone resting on the armrest. He could speak one phrase, just 3 words, and the heartbeat of the airline would stop. Every boarding pass, every gate, every departure screen would go dark. But he waited. He wanted everyone in this cabin to understand what was being tested, not his right to a seat, but the dignity of every person who had ever been told, in ways subtle or blatant, that they did not belong. 30 seconds, Marcus warned. Jordan looked directly at Clara, then at David. His voice was calm, unhurried, carrying through the cabin like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "For sitting in the seat I purchased," he said, "you are threatening to arrest me. And tell me, officer, what is the actual charge?" Marcus hesitated. His radio crackled. The silence that followed was heavier than the engines outside. Jordan reached for his phone. The cabin held its breath. The cabin of Atlantic Skyflight 972 felt smaller now, as if the air itself had contracted under the pressure of what was unfolding. Every passenger leaned in, pretending to read magazines or scroll through phones, but their ears were tuned to seat 1A, where Jordan Maxwell sat, motionless yet commanding. Security Officer Marcus Delgado stood only a few feet away, hand hovering near the cuffs, clipped to his belt. His voice had carried the authority of protocol, but Jordan's last question still hung unanswered in the air. "For what exactly?" Jordan had asked, eyes steady. "Am I being arrested? What crime have I committed by sitting in the seat I purchased?" The silence that followed spread like ripples. Evelyn Hart in 1F breathed out sharply, almost a whisper of relief that someone had said it aloud. The young mother in 2B clutched her child closer. The man in 1C shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado dissolving under the weight of the question. Clara Jensen stood stiff, clipboard pressed against her chest as if it were armor. David Ortiz lingered at her shoulder, his jaw tight. They had followed procedure, hadn't they? At least that was the shield they wanted to believe in. But the cracks were visible. Marcus Delgado's radio hissed, a burst of static followed by hurried voices from the ground. He turned his head, listening. His eyes flicked back to Jordan, then to Clara, then down to his shoes. "Time is up," Clara said suddenly, her voice sharp and triumphant. "Officer, remove him." Jordan's hand moved calmly, deliberately. He picked up his phone from the armrest, its dark screen lighting with a fingerprint touch. His voice was low but carried across the cabin. "Activate Protocol 7. Passengers stiffened. Some did not understand. Some thought it was a bluff. But Lily Tran's phone caught every word, streaming to more than 40,000 viewers now. Her chat exploded with speculation. What's Protocol 7? Is he serious? This man looks calm. Something's about to happen. A woman's voice came from Jordan's phone. Clear. Professional. Protocol 7 confirmed, system entering shutdown sequence. At that exact moment, the overhead chime of the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, usually measured and calm,
carried an edge. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue with our departure system. Please remain seated. Groans filled the cabin. Phones lit up. The man in 1C muttered angrily, "Unbelievable. Just throw him off." But his voice lacked conviction now. Clara blinked rapidly, her confidence faltering. David's eyes darted to the cockpit door, then back at Jordan. "What did you just do?" he asked, his voice lower, uncertain. Jordan leaned back slightly, as if he had merely adjusted his seatbelt. "You'll see." Marcus Delgado's radio erupted again, this time frantic. "All departures halted. Repeat, all Atlantic sky departures are halted. Ground stop initiated nationwide." The officer's eyes widened. He stepped back instinctively, as though distance could shield him from the shock. Around the cabin, passengers whispered, phones clutched tight as notifications lit up with breaking news alerts. Lily turned her phone toward Jordan. Her voice shook with disbelief. "He just shut down the airline. You're watching history. People. 55,000 viewers. Oh my God." Clara took a step closer, her voice brittle. You can't do that. You're just a passenger." Jordan's gaze met hers, calm but unyielding. "I'm not just a passenger. I'm the CEO of Stratos Systems. My company runs every reservation, every departure, every boarding pass your airline relies on, and you've just triggered Clause 14.2 of our service contract." The words hit like thunder. David blinked, his mouth opening slightly, but no words coming. Clara's clipboard slipped in her grip. "What clause?" she asked weakly. Jordan spoke evenly, as though reading from memory. "Any proven act of discrimination at a customer touchpoint constitutes a material breach. That breach grants Stratos Systems the right to execute emergency protocols to protect our interests and reputation. That's what you just witnessed. The cost to your airline, should I choose, is approximately $2.8 billion and counting." Evelyn Hart gave a small, audible gasp. The young mother in 2B whispered, "Lord have mercy." The man in 1C, who had been so loud before, now stared down at his phone, scrolling furiously, no longer looking anyone in the eye. The intercom chimed again. The captain's voice this time was tense, almost cracking. "Ladies and gentlemen, our systems are currently offline. We are awaiting instructions from operations." David finally found his voice, though it trembled. "Hugh, you can't mean to keep the entire airline grounded." Jordan's eyes never left him. "I mean to show you what happens when power is abused and dignity is denied. This is not about revenge. This is about consequence." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. The tremor in her hands betrayed her. Marcus Delgado, once prepared to enforce protocol with cuffs, now stepped back further. His radio squawked again, the words audible to those nearest. "CEO is demanding to know what triggered this. Repeat. CEO wants immediate identification of root cause." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Jordan answered the call on his phone. His tone was professional, almost casual. Jordan Maxwell. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, strained. "Jordan, this is Robert Kane, CEO of Atlantic Sky. Our entire system has crashed. Reports say the shutdown originated from Stratos Systems." "Is this true?" Passengers froze. Even Clara and David leaned in unconsciously, unable to help themselves. Jordan's reply was measured. "Surgical. Correct. I activated the shutdown under Clause 14.2. Your staff initiated a discriminatory action against me at boarding and again in this cabin. The breach is undeniable." Robert Kane's voice wavered, audible even to those nearest. "Jordan, for God's sake, we have flights across the country. Thousands of passengers. Stock is already plummeting. What do you want?" Jordan let the silence hold for a moment. He wanted every person in this cabin to feel the weight of what was happening. He wanted Lily's camera to capture not just his words, but the hush that surrounded them. 3 things, Jordan said finally. First, immediate suspension of Clara Jensen, pending full investigation. Second, mandatory bias and empathy training for all frontline staff, completed within 60 days. Third, the establishment of an independent reporting system insulated from your bureaucracy so no complaint can be buried. Gasps broke through the rows. Clara's face drained of color. David swallowed hard, sweat glistening at his temples. Evelyn Hart nodded slowly, her eyes glimmering with something close to satisfaction. "And if we refuse?" Robert asked, his voice lower now, almost pleading. Jordan tapped a few keys on his laptop, the glow illuminating his face. "Then your airline has 702 hours to replace Stratos Systems as your global provider. I doubt anyone can deliver before your operations collapse entirely. The choice is yours." A long pause followed, so long that the hum of the air conditioning filled the space. Finally, Robert's voice came, heavy with resignation. "You'll have it, all 3 demands, within the hour." Jordan leaned back, folding his hands. "Good, but remember, this isn't my victory. It's your test. Whether you choose to change for real or just for appearances will determine what happens next." Clara sank into an empty seat, her eyes wide, hands trembling. David stood rigid, as if unsure whether to apologize or to defend himself. Marcus Delgado retreated a step further, radio buzzing incessantly. The passengers were silent. Some stared at Jordan with awe, some with shame, but none could deny what they had witnessed. On Lily's stream, comments poured in. "This is justice. This is history. This is how change begins." Viewer count 90,000 and climbing. Jordan opened his laptop again, as if nothing unusual had happened, the glow of spreadsheets steady on his face. But everyone around him knew the world had shifted. The engines outside remained silent. The true turbulence was happening here. In Seat 1A, the cabin of Atlantic Sky Flight 972 was hushed, but it was no longer the silence of luxury. It was the silence of a courtroom. Each passenger felt as though they had been sworn in as a witness, unable to leave, unable to ignore, bound to this unfolding trial in the sky. Jordan Maxwell sat upright in Seat 1A, phone against his ear, eyes steady. His voice carried enough for the nearest rows to hear, while Lily Tran's livestream caught every syllable for an audience that had now surged past 120,000 viewers on the other end of the line. Robert Kane, CEO of Atlantic Sky Airlines, exhaled audibly. He was a man used to commanding boardrooms and conferences, but today his words came weighted with panic. "Jordan," Robert said, his voice tight, "you know what this shutdown means. We have planes grounded across the country. Our stock is crashing in real time. Every minute costs millions. You cannot possibly want to burn this entire company down." Jordan's reply was slow and deliberate. "I don't want destruction, Robert. I want transformation. But sometimes the threat of collapse is the only way to make people pay attention." Clara Jensen flinched at her seat, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. David Ortiz stood frozen, lips pressed tight. Marcus Delgado listened with his radio still buzzing at his side, torn between duty and the dawning realization of a larger truth. Passengers leaned closer. Even those who had earlier complained about delays now stared at Jordan as if seeing him for the first time. Robert's voice crackled through the phone speaker, frustration breaking through. "You've made your demands clear. Clara's suspension, training for frontline staff, independent reporting. Fine. We will do it, but this must stop now. Bring our systems back online." Jordan's eyes moved slowly across the cabin, settling on Clara. His voice remained level, almost unnervingly calm. "Not yet. There's one more condition. The tension snapped tighter, like a wire pulled to its limit. Robert hesitated. What more could you possibly want? Jordan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. I want Clara Jensen to be the first to complete the training. And after she finishes, she will be the one to lead sessions for others. She will carry the weight of teaching what she once failed to see. Clara's head shot up, eyes wide. What? She stammered. Why me? Jordan's gaze was unflinching, because punishment without the chance to change is revenge, and opportunity without consequence is enabling. You don't need only suspension, you need transformation, and you will become a vessel for it. The cabin was stunned. Evelyn Hart whispered, almost reverent, My God, he's not just holding them accountable, he's making them change. Robert Kane's voice on the line wavered. Jordan, that's highly irregular. We can't. You can, Jordan interrupted, and you will, or Protocol 7 remains active. Choose. For several beats, there was only the sound of Robert's muffled advisors in the background, voices shouting, papers shuffling, the chaos of a corporate command center unraveling. Finally, Robert's voice returned, low and strained. Fine, she will do it. I'll put it in writing myself. You have my word. Jordan's expression did not shift. Your word means little. Robert, I want signatures, a signed agreement delivered within 60 minutes, and I want it released publicly, not buried in some internal memo. People deserve to see that consequence has meaning. Robert let out a long breath. You'll have it. Within the hour. Just, please, bring us back. Jordan ended the call without farewell, placing the phone gently on the table. For a moment, the cabin remained frozen, as though afraid to breathe. Then whispers began to swell. He's the CEO of Stratosystems, someone whispered. He grounded the whole airline. This is history. Lily held her phone close, whispering to her audience. You all heard that. He's not just fighting for himself. He's demanding change for everyone. This is so much bigger than a seat. Clara finally found her voice, though it shook. Mr. Maxwell, I didn't mean to. Jordan's eyes met hers, steady and heavy with weight. Intent is irrelevant. The outcome is what matters. Your words questioned my right to exist in this seat, in this space. That harm ripples beyond me. It touches every person who has ever been told they don't belong. What you do next will decide if you remain part of the problem or become part of the solution. Clara bowed her head, her hands trembling. For the first time, her arrogance dissolved into something closer to fear, and perhaps recognition. David Ortiz stepped forward, his voice halting. I should have stopped it. I should have spoken up when I saw where this was going. Jordan's tone was even but unrelenting. You could have, but you didn't. Now you have a choice. Learn or repeat. That choice will define your career. The captain's voice interrupted over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are awaiting clearance from operations. Please remain patient. The words were carefully chosen, but his tone carried an undercurrent of awareness. He knew what was happening. In 1F, Evelyn Hart sat straighter, her gaze fixed on Jordan. She spoke softly, but her voice carried. 50 years ago, I marched so my children might have better. I never thought I'd live to see a man use power this way. This is justice. The young mother in 2B nodded, whispering, It feels like he's fighting for all of us. Jordan leaned back, exhaling slowly, as though he had carried the weight of centuries in that single negotiation. But inside, his thoughts were still sharp, still turning. He knew this was only the beginning. Robert Kane might sign the papers, but true change required more than signatures. It required enforcement, witnesses, and memory. His phone buzzed again. A text from Strata Systems headquarters appeared. Phase 1 shutdown complete. Full restart possible in 5 minutes. Await your command. Jordan closed his eyes briefly. He thought of his father's voice from years ago, telling him that justice was not about vengeance, but about leaving doors open for others. He thought of his daughter, Maya, and the world he wanted her to inherit. He thought of every moment when silence had been the easier choice, but never the right one. He opened his eyes, calm once more. He would restart the system soon, but not before the world had fully absorbed what had happened here. Lily's voice whispered from across the aisle, trembling with awe. He hasn't even played his final move yet. Her live stream flashed with comments. This is bigger than a protest. This is strategy. He's teaching us how to fight. Jordan looked at her for the first time, acknowledging the teenager with the phone. His eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. "Keep filming," he said quietly. Lily's breath caught. She nodded. "I will." The cabin sat in silence again, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of anticipation. Everyone knew they had witnessed something unprecedented. Everyone knew the world outside was already reacting, headlines forming, stocks tumbling, hashtags trending, and Jordan Maxwell sat in 1A, the calm in the center of the storm, waiting for the ink to dry on promises that would test the integrity of an entire industry. The air in the cabin seemed thicker, as though everyone was inhaling together, waiting for a verdict that had not yet arrived. Phones buzzed in quiet unison, notifications from news apps lighting up screens with breaking alerts. Outside the windows, the runway lights burned steady, but no wheels moved. The entire airline was frozen, held in suspension by the will of one man in seat 1A. Jordan Maxwell sat calmly, his laptop open in front of him. His reflection flickered faintly across the black glass when the screen dimmed between keystrokes. His posture was unhurried, but his presence was magnetic. Every detail of his composure magnified in the tense stillness of the first-class cabin. Clara Jensen sat only 2 rows away, her body folded inward, hands gripping the apron that once gave her authority. Now it felt like a costume that no longer fit. She stared at her own shoes, unable to look up. Every fiber of her training had told her that passengers must be controlled. Rules must be enforced. Procedure above all else. Yet here she was, confronted with the realization that procedure had been weaponized against dignity, and the cost was catastrophic. David Ortiz stood near the galley, his eyes darting between Jordan and the passengers. He had always prided himself on loyalty to policy, but in this moment, loyalty felt like cowardice. He wanted to speak, but the weight of his earlier silence pinned him down. Marcus Delgado, the security officer, remained close to the cockpit door. His radio was still alive with urgent chatter, but he no longer relayed any of it. Instead, he stood still, gaze fixed on Jordan, as if rethinking every moment in his career when he had followed an order without questioning its justice. The captain's voice broke the silence again, steady but subdued. "Ladies and gentlemen, operations is advising us to remain seated. We will provide further updates shortly." The words were vague, but his tone carried a message that passengers understood something monumental was happening. Jordan's phone vibrated on the table. He lifted it, glancing at the secure message flashing across the encrypted screen. Draft agreement transmitted. Awaiting review. He tapped the screen and opened the file. A legal document unfolded, filled with clauses and signatures still awaiting completion. The Atlantic sky letterhead glowed under the cabin lights. He read the opening lines carefully, silently mouthing each demand as his eyes tracked the page. Suspension of Clara Jensen. Mandatory unconscious bias and empathy training for all frontline staff. Completion within 60 days. Implementation of an independent reporting system insulated from executive suppression. His lips tightened as he continued down the page. There it was, the clause he had added in the call: Clara Jensen to be the first trainee, and following completion she would assume a role as a peer trainer. It was in black and white. Impossible to erase. A small murmur moved through the cabin. The teenage live streamer Lily Tran whispered into her phone. He's got the contract in front of him. It's real. I think they actually signed it. Her viewership count ticked upward, 180,000, climbing. Jordan looked up briefly. His eyes moved across the rows, settling on Clara. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. For the first time since the confrontation began, she raised her eyes to meet his. She started, but her voice broke. She tried again. Mr. Maxwell, I didn't understand. I thought I was just doing my job. Jordan studied her, his gaze firm, but not cruel. That's the problem, Clara. Doing your job without questioning its impact can become complicity. Power without reflection becomes prejudice in uniform. Clara blinked, her lips parting. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words collapsed before they formed. She lowered her head again. David Ortiz finally stepped forward. His voice trembled, but he spoke loud enough for passengers to hear. Mr. Maxwell, if there's a way to make this right, I want to try. I failed in that moment, but I don't want to fail again. Jordan's expression softened only slightly. Acknowledgement is the first step, but action is what matters. You and Clara both have a chance to transform not only yourselves, but the culture you serve. Take it seriously. Lives depend on it. From Seat 1F. Evelyn Hart leaned forward. Her silver hair gleamed in the overhead light, her eyes alive with conviction. He's telling the truth. I've lived long enough to see the same mistake repeated generation after generation. The only way it ends is when people like you choose courage over convenience. Her words lingered like a benediction. The young mother in 2B nodded, whispering, "That's right. I want my daughter to grow up in a world where a seat isn't decided by skin." Lily swung her camera back to Jordan. They're all listening to him. Everyone in here knows this is bigger than one flight. Her audience flooded her feed with comments. This is justice in real time. He's forcing them to see. He's teaching the whole world. Jordan scrolled through the last page of the agreement. The final line awaited his digital signature, but he paused. Instead, he picked up the phone again and dialed Robert Kane. The call connected instantly. "Robert," Jordan said evenly, "the draft is satisfactory, but I want public confirmation. I want you to announce these commitments in writing and release them to the press within the hour." Robert's voice came back hoarse, weary. "It's already being prepared. Our communications team will send the release. Please, Jordan, we need our systems back. Planes are stranded. Passengers are furious. The board is calling for my head." Jordan's reply was calm but surgical. "Then prove your leadership by standing with reform, not against it. If you keep your promises, you might save more than your company. You might set a precedent for an industry that has hidden behind procedure for too long." Robert was silent for a long moment. Finally he said, "You'll have the release within the hour. On my word." Jordan ended the call. He tapped a sequence on his laptop, issuing the command for Phase 1 system restoration. A progress bar slid across the screen. Restart in 4 minutes, 30 seconds. He closed the lid gently and folded his hands. His gaze swept across the cabin, resting briefly on each face. On Clara, pale and shaken. On David, stiff with regret. On Marcus, radio buzzing but ignored. On Evelyn, eyes glowing with memory and fire. On Lily, her phone a window to the world. He spoke softly, but every word carried. This is not about me. It's about all of us. Change doesn't begin with anger alone. It begins when anger becomes strategy, when injustice becomes consequence, when silence becomes witness. The cabin remained still, his words weaving into the air like threads binding everyone together. Even those who had earlier doubted him now nodded slowly, almost involuntarily. The intercom chimed again. The captain's voice was steadier now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have confirmation that systems are being restored. We expect clearance to taxi shortly. Relief rippled through the rows, but no one cheered. Everyone knew the real story was still unfolding. Jordan leaned back in his seat. His eyes closed briefly, but his mind was awake, calculating. He thought of the millions watching through Lily's phone. He thought of the ripple effect these policies could have if enforced with integrity. He thought of the memory that had driven him all these years, an 8-year-old boy turned away from a country club pool, told he didn't belong. Today, that boy had written a new rule book. The engines outside whirred to life, but inside the cabin the energy was still heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The story would leave the plane, but the responsibility would remain with each witness. Jordan opened his eyes, gaze sharp again. He knew the world was listening. He knew this was only the beginning. The engines outside roared to life again, their vibrations trembling faintly beneath the cabin floor. For most flights, that sound signaled routine, the beginning of a journey, the promise of destination. On this day, for the passengers of Atlantic Sky Flight 972, it carried another meaning. It was the sound of a company bending under the weight of accountability. The captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, our systems have been restored. We've received clearance to taxi. Please remain seated as we prepare for departure." His words were calm, but everyone in the cabin could hear the tension layered beneath. Even the cockpit crew understood this was no ordinary delay. Jordan Maxwell sat in 1A, his laptop closed, hands folded loosely in his lap. His body radiated composure, but inside his thoughts moved like a current. He had forced Robert Kane to concede, had extracted promises that could transform an airline and perhaps an industry. Yet Jordan knew the harder battle always began after the signatures dried. Words on paper were fragile things unless guarded by vigilance. Across the aisle, Clara Jensen felt her throat tighten as the engines surged. Only hours ago, she had moved through the cabin with unchallenged authority. Now every shift of her body felt scrutinized, every silence weighted. Her mind replayed the words she had spoken to Jordan, words that now tasted like rust. "This seat is not for people like you." She could still hear the certainty in her own tone, a certainty she no longer recognized as her own. She thought about her training sessions, the binders filled with procedures, the drilled phrases of customer management. Never once had they forced her to reflect on bias, on power, on the human weight of dismissing someone's dignity. She pressed her palms together tightly, as if the pressure might hold back the flood of shame rising inside. David Ortiz, standing near the galley, watched her from the corner of his eye. He recognized the struggle written across her face because it mirrored his own. He had backed her call without hesitation. Policy had been his anchor for years, and policy had betrayed him. He wondered if passengers could ever look at him again without seeing complicity. At the far end of the row, Evelyn Hart shifted in her seat. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of her armrests, her voice low but steady. "Clara, she said softly. The flight attendant turned, startled. You may spend the rest of your life wishing you could take those words back. But wishing is nothing without work. Do the work. That is how you make this moment mean something. Clara swallowed hard. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. The elderly woman's presence felt almost maternal, like a reminder that life gave second chances only if one was brave enough to take them. Meanwhile, Lily Tran's live stream had surged to nearly 250,000 viewers. Her phone battery blinked red, but she refused to lower it. The scrolling comments poured faster than she could read. This is history. He's changing the game. Why is no one else doing this?
Jordan Maxwell became a trending name across multiple platforms within minutes. Screenshots of him in 1A spread like wildfire. Lily whispered into her phone, "They're telling us the plane is about to take off, but you can feel it. Everyone in here knows this flight will be remembered forever." Her hand trembled slightly, but she kept recording, instinctively understanding that her role was not small. She was a witness for thousands, soon millions. Jordan glanced at her briefly. For an instant, his gaze softened. He knew she was young, perhaps too young to carry the burden of narrating a global event. Yet he also knew that truth had always relied on those willing to keep their eyes open. He gave her the smallest nod. She straightened her shoulders, gripping the phone more firmly. The aircraft began to roll. The movement pressed passengers gently back into their seats, but no one relaxed. Conversations rippled in hushed tones. A businessman in 4A muttered to his colleague, "Our clients are already messaging me." They saw the live stream. The young mother in 2B bent close to her sleeping toddler, whispering a quiet prayer that the world her daughter grew into would remember this night. Jordan leaned back, his eyes half closed, but his mind remained sharp. He thought of Robert Kane's promise, the agreement sent to his laptop, the press release being drafted at that very moment. He thought of how easily corporations buried inconvenient truths once headlines cooled. He thought of his responsibility to make sure this time was different. Inside. An old memory flickered again. The country club gate, the sting of rejection, the sound of water splashing beyond a fence he was never allowed to cross, the humiliation of being told he did not belong. Today, as the jet moved toward the runway, that memory felt like it had been rewritten. He was no longer the boy outside the fence. He was the man who built the locks, the contracts, the codes that determined whether the gate even opened. The plane paused at the runway threshold. Lights outside blinked red and white, casting rhythmic flashes through the cabin windows. In that brief stillness, Jordan opened his eyes. He spoke quietly, but every word carried. This is not over. What happens after we land will matter more than what has happened here. Remember that. Each of you has witnessed a system forced to change. Don't let that memory fade when the news cycle moves on. Passengers shifted, some nodding slowly. Evelyn murmured, "I won't forget." The young mother squeezed her child closer. Even the man in 1C, who had earlier sneered, now sat with his head bowed, lips pressed tight in shame. Clara raised her head slightly. Her voice came out rough but clear enough. "Mr. Maxwell, I will take the training. I'll do it right. Not because I have to, but because I need to. I can't let this moment pass without becoming better." Jordan regarded her steadily. After a long pause, he inclined his head. "Then, start now. Every decision from this point on is a choice. Choose differently." The engines roared as the plane surged forward. Acceleration pinned them into their seats. The cabin vibrated with the force of departure, but the silence among passengers remained intact. It felt less like a routine takeoff and more like a collective breath being held for something larger.
The wheels lifted, gravity shifted, the ground fell away beneath them, city lights shrinking into a scatter of gold against the night. Inside, Lily's phone caught the moment. Her voice trembled with awe. We're in the air now, but it feels like the real journey is just starting. Comments flooded faster than ever. Millions will see this. This will be studied. History at 35,000 feet. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, letting the vibration of ascent steady his thoughts. He knew headlines would spin, stock markets would react, politicians might posture, but none of that mattered as much as the quiet transformations inside this cabin. Clara's trembling resolve, David's regret, Evelyn's affirmation, Lily's witness. These were the seeds of change. The aircraft pierced through the first thin layer of clouds, climbing into the smooth darkness above. Stars began to scatter across the windows like silent witnesses themselves. Jordan exhaled, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. This is only the beginning. The plane climbed higher, breaking free of turbulence until the ascent smoothed into level flight. Outside the windows, the last traces of the city dissolved into pinpricks of light. The cabin lights dimmed, bathing the rows in a soft amber glow. For the first time in over an hour, there was a semblance of normality. Yet every passenger knew nothing about this flight was normal. The seatbelt sign chimed, releasing passengers from restraint. Some stretched their arms, others fumbled with phones to message loved ones, but no one could fully relax. The weight of what had just transpired still hung over the cabin like an invisible storm cloud. In seat 1A, Jordan Maxwell pressed the edge of his thumb against his temple, a small motion betraying the depth of his thoughts. His laptop rested on the tray before him, screen blank for now. He let silence sit with him, though inside his mind churned with the recognition of what came next. He had forced Robert Kane to sign commitments, but contracts meant little without enforcement. Systems could be restarted, but cultures took longer to rewire. He replayed Clara Jensen's voice in his mind. I'll take the training. I need to. There had been sincerity in her tone, yet Jordan knew sincerity was often fleeting. Would she truly transform, or would her remorse dissolve once headlines faded? He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that giving someone the chance to grow could ripple into something larger. His eyes shifted toward Clara, seated near the galley. She sat rigid, staring at her own hands, fingers curling and uncurling. The authority she once wielded so confidently had vanished, replaced by a fragile uncertainty. David Ortiz stood nearby, arms folded, lips pressed into a line. He carried himself like a man facing trial in his own conscience. Jordan studied them both silently. They had become unwilling symbols, mirrors of an industry that treated policy like armor while ignoring the humanity it should protect. A voice rose from a few rows back. It was Lily Tran, still holding her phone aloft, speaking into the lens with steady urgency. We're at 35,000 feet, but the story is still unfolding. Viewers, you've seen everything live. You've watched a man stand his ground against discrimination, and you've seen an airline forced to change. This isn't just a delay anymore.
This is history happening right above the clouds. Her audience surged again. The counter flashed past 300,000. Comments flooded across her screen. Global news is picking this up. He shut down the whole airline. This is bigger than Rosa Parks. Jordan heard faint fragments of the chatter and closed his eyes briefly. He never asked for comparison to heroes of the past, but he understood the echo. In seat 1F, Evelyn Hart adjusted her shawl and leaned closer to the aisle. "Mr. Maxwell," she said softly. Jordan turned his head toward her. "Yes, ma'am."
"You carry this with grace," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But I want you to remember something. The weight of justice is heavy. You cannot carry it alone. The witnesses matter. We matter. We saw this. We'll tell it. You don't have to hold the entire burden." Jordan let her words sink in. He gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that he heard her, that he would remember. In the cockpit, Captain Rivera adjusted the throttle slightly, exchanging a look with his first officer. They both knew their role tonight extended beyond safe flight. They had become custodians of a moment that would outlive the flight itself. Back in New York, Atlantic Sky's headquarters buzzed like a hive in crisis. Screens blared red alerts. Executives clustered in small groups, speaking over one another. Robert Kane stood at the head of the operations table, tie loosened, sweat staining his collar. His phone was pressed to his ear as he listened to updates from communications staff. Social media mentions are past 2 million, one analyst said, voice rising. The hashtag #SeatWhileBlack is trending worldwide. A legal officer flipped through the draft Jordan had forced them to issue. "We can sign it, but compliance will be brutal. 60 days is impossible." Robert slammed a hand on the table. "Then make it possible. If we don't comply, he'll cancel the contract."
Do you understand what that means? $2.8 billion in losses, and we'd have no infrastructure to run our airline. His voice cracked at the edges. We don't have a choice. Board members dialed in remotely. Faces projected across multiple screens. Some demanded explanations. Others threatened resignation. You let this happen on your watch? One accused, you let a single passenger bring down the airline. Robert bristled. That passenger is not ordinary. Jordan Maxwell runs the very systems we depend on. He leveraged power we gave him because our staff humiliated him. This isn't just on him. This is on all of us. Silence fell across the room for a beat, broken only by the hum of air vents and the shuffle of papers. The truth was undeniable. They had underestimated the cost of everyday prejudice, and now the entire world was watching. Back on the plane. Lily lowered her phone slightly to rub her eyes. Her voice cracked with fatigue, but she continued streaming. People keep asking in the comments, what happens next? I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. Everyone in here feels different than they did an hour ago. We're not just passengers anymore. We're witnesses. Her words lingered, rippling across the cabin. Some passengers nodded quietly. Others stared out the window, lost in thought. Even the skeptical man in 1C sat with arms crossed, brow furrowed, as if replaying the ugliness of his earlier remarks. Jordan opened his laptop again, fingers gliding over the keyboard. The system dashboard displayed a cascade of green indicators. Restoration was complete. Flights across the country were lifting again. Engines were roaring to life at gates that had stood still. His company had restored the heartbeat of an airline, but the larger pulse he wanted to restore could not be tracked by software. He typed a quick message to his chief of staff. Agreement secured. Public release imminent. Begin monitoring compliance immediately. No loopholes. No excuses. He hit send, then leaned back, exhaling slowly. Marcus Delgado, the security officer, finally stepped closer. His posture had softened, the rigid script of enforcement abandoned. "Mr. Maxwell," he said quietly, "I need to say something. I almost put cuffs on you. If I had, it would have been the greatest mistake of my career. I see that now." Jordan regarded him with steady eyes. "Marcus, the test isn't whether you almost made a mistake. The test is what you do next time you're given that order. Will you follow the script, or will you listen to your conscience?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'll remember this. I won't make that mistake again." Jordan gave a single nod, not as forgiveness, but as recognition.
The flight attendants moved slowly through the cabin now, offering water and snacks. Their motions were mechanical, but their eyes betrayed turmoil. Clara avoided Jordan's gaze, yet when she passed his row, she hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she set a glass of water on his tray. "Mr. Maxwell," she whispered, barely audible. "Thank you for not destroying me completely. You had the power to, but you didn't." Jordan met her eyes, his tone even. "Accountability isn't destruction, it's construction. Use it to build something better." She nodded once, retreating with the weight of his words pressed onto her shoulders. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane settled into its night rhythm. Some passengers closed their eyes. Others scrolled endlessly through feeds, buzzing with the story they had just lived. The atmosphere was not one of relaxation, but of reflection, as though every person on board understood they carried something heavy that must be shared when they landed. Jordan closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he let himself breathe. The boy at the country club gate was gone. The man in 1A remained, carrying not just contracts and systems, but responsibility. He knew tomorrow the headlines would twist and turn, politicians would weigh in, stock prices would fluctuate, but none of that mattered as much as the single truth Evelyn had spoken. Witnesses matter. They would carry this forward. At cruising altitude, with stars gleaming beyond the windows and the hum of engines steadying the night. Jordan Maxwell knew this was no longer a fight for one man's seat. It was the beginning of a new chapter in how dignity would be defended at 35,000 feet and beyond. The aircraft leveled in its steady cruise, engines humming a deep rhythm through the fuselage. Passengers slowly adjusted to the quiet, but the silence felt temporary, like the pause between lightning and thunder. They all sensed the next storm would not come from inside the cabin, but from outside, where the world had begun to watch. Lily Tran's phone glowed like a beacon. Her stream had surpassed 500,000 live viewers. Major outlets had picked it up, embedding her shaky video into breaking news segments. On television screens in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, anchors replayed the moment Jordan Maxwell said the words, "Protocol 7, activate system-wide." In a Manhattan newsroom, producers barked orders. "Run the clip again. Get me background on this Maxwell guy. I want everything. His company, his contracts, his net worth." Screens lit up with photos of Jordan in boardrooms, at tech conferences, shaking hands with government officials. A headline scrolled across the ticker Black CEO grounds airline in first-class discrimination standoff. In Washington, D.C., staffers huddled in congressional offices. One aide read comments aloud. "Senator, people are already calling this Rosa Parks in the sky." Another added, "Civil rights committees will want a statement. We can't ignore this." At Atlantic Sky headquarters, Robert Kane stood in the center of a ring of executives. Sweat dampened the edges of his shirt. His phone vibrated nonstop with texts from investors and politicians. A vice president shoved a tablet into his hands. Stocks down 8% in after-hours trading. It will get worse by morning. Robert rubbed his temples, his voice sharp. "We can't fight this. We have to lean into compliance, draft a statement, admit the error, commit to reform, and pray it buys us time." A communications officer hesitated. "Do we name him? Do we acknowledge Maxwell directly?" Robert's jaw tightened. "We have no choice. He holds our systems in his hands. Pretending he doesn't exist would look worse." Back at 35,000 feet, Jordan sat with his laptop open, but he was not typing. He was staring at the cabin. He could feel the weight of every gaze. Some looked at him with admiration, others with unease, but all with recognition. He had become something more than a man in 1A. He was now a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. Evelyn Hart leaned toward him. They're going to turn you into a headline, Sun, maybe even a movement. Are you ready for that? Jordan exhaled slowly. I did not ask to be a symbol, but I knew when I wrote Protocol 7 that one day it might come to this. I hoped it wouldn't, but I prepared, in case it did. A passenger in row 3, a businessman with tired eyes, asked softly, "Why did you create something like that, a kill switch strong enough to freeze an entire airline?" Was it just about leverage? Jordan's voice dropped, calm but firm. It was about dignity. 5 years ago, I negotiated that clause into the contract. I had seen too many service industries hide behind apologies after humiliating customers. I wanted a safeguard, one that forced real consequences if discrimination was proven. So I built it in, a clause they never thought would be pulled, until today. The businessman nodded, silent now, digesting the weight of the answer. Clara Jensen sat a few rows back, listening. Every word struck deeper. She had not only been the trigger for Protocol 7, but the embodiment of why it existed in the first place. Her chest tightened. Shame pressed against her ribs, but beneath it flickered something else, the first fragile spark of determination to change. David Ortiz finally broke his silence. His voice was quiet, directed more at himself than anyone else. All these years, I thought following procedure made me safe. I see now it only made me blind. Marcus Delgado, the security officer, shifted in his seat. We're trained to enforce, not to question. Tonight I realize the danger of that. If I had cuffed you, Mr. Maxwell, I would have been another headline in the wrong way. And it would have haunted me forever. Jordan looked at him steadily. What matters now is not the mistake you almost made. It is the choice you make the next time you're faced with that moment. Growth is never abstract. It happens in the decision you make when no one is watching. Lily's voice cut through again, softer now, almost reverent. People in the comments keep saying this feels like a turning point. They're calling you the man who grounded an airline for justice. She swallowed, eyes wide. What do you want them to know? Mr. Maxwell Jordan hesitated, considering. The cabin leaned in, waiting. Finally, he spoke. I want them to know this is not about me. It is not about a single contract or a single airline. It is about the truth that dignity must be defended by consequences, not excuses. If my actions tonight mean anything, let them mean that systems can no longer treat bias as a training slide or a quarterly review. Bias has to carry cost, or it will never change. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of engines and the faint crackle of Lily's phone transmitting his words across the world. On the ground, those words lit fire across social media. Activists tweeted them. Journalists quoted them in real time. Civil rights organizations prepared press releases. Even rival airlines drafted memos to their boards. What if he turns his systems against us next? In the Atlantic Sky boardroom, Robert Kane lowered his head into his hands. A vice president whispered, "He's framing this as a precedent. If other companies follow, every airline in the industry will be forced to change." Robert muttered, "Then maybe it's time we did change." His tone carried defeat, but also the faintest recognition of inevitability. Back in the cabin, Evelyn leaned toward Jordan again. You planted a seed tonight. Don't underestimate how far roots can spread. Jordan gave her a small smile. I don't underestimate it. I only hope people water it. The plane continued through the night sky, steady and unwavering. But inside, passengers carried a sense of being part of something larger than the metal tube that held them. They were witnesses, and witnesses carried responsibility. Lily lowered her phone for a moment, her hand shaking. She whispered to the young mother beside her, "I think this video is going to change my life. Not just because people are watching, but because I saw it happen with my own eyes. The mother nodded, rocking her toddler gently. Sometimes the world needs young eyes to remind it what's true. Jordan leaned back, folding his hands, gaze drifting to the stars beyond the window. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. Not victory, but purpose fulfilled. The boy who once stood outside a country club gate had written a clause that turned humiliation into accountability. And tonight, that clause had reshaped not just a flight, but an entire industry's conscience. Far below, in cities and towns, televisions glowed, phones buzzed, and conversations erupted. Families debated at dinner tables. Students texted late into the night. Pilots and flight attendants shared hushed words in crew lounges. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. In the sky, Jordan Maxwell closed his eyes briefly. He knew tomorrow would bring headlines, questions, perhaps even attacks on his motives. But tonight, at 35,000 feet, he allowed himself one thought. Change was possible, and he had just proved it. The cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a rhythm that carried the undertone of suppressed thunder. Drinks were served, trays clinked softly, but no one forgot that the world outside was watching them. The flight had become a stage, and each passenger felt both the audience and the cast. Jordan Maxwell sat in his seat, hands folded over his laptop. His body was calm, but his mind pressed forward like gears turning in a machine. The system was restored, the contract signed, but this moment was far from over. He could feel it in the way the air thickened, in the glances passengers traded, in the weight of stories itching to be spoken aloud. Evelyn Hart was the first to break the silence. Her voice, gentle yet edged with memory, floated across the rows. "I was turned away from a hotel once," she said, "told my reservation didn't exist. Even as I held the printed confirmation in my hand, I knew what it really meant. It wasn't the paper they doubted, it was me." She paused, her wrinkled fingers tightening on her shawl. "I let it pass that day. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. Tonight, I realized silence only taught them they could do it again." The mother in 2B leaned forward, her child asleep against her shoulder. "I know what you mean. Last month at a rental counter, they asked if my husband was coming to sign. I told them no. The car was under my name. They smiled like it was a mistake, like my card wasn't good enough on its own. My little girl saw it. She asked why they laughed at me. What do you even say to a child?" A hush filled the space, broken by the businessman in 3C. His tie was loosened now, his earlier irritation stripped away. "At my golf club, I watched a friend of mine get stopped every other visit. Same guard, same questions, as if his membership card had to be proven again and again. I stayed quiet. I told myself I didn't want to cause trouble, but maybe staying quiet was causing trouble too." Each story dropped like a pebble in water, rippling outward, colliding, overlapping. The cabin transformed from scattered individuals into a chorus of lived experiences, their voices weaving into a fabric that could no longer be ignored. Jordan listened, his gaze steady, but inside his chest stirred a heaviness. This was what he had always known. Discrimination was not an isolated incident, but a pattern, a chain forged link by link. What he had done tonight was break one link, but the chain stretched far beyond this cabin. Lily Tran, still holding her phone, whispered into the lens, "Do you hear this? It's not just about one man in one seat. Everyone has a story. And maybe that's the point. None of us are alone in it." Her viewer count climbed past 700,000. Comments flooded in like a tide. "My dad went through this at a bank. This happened to me at college. I thought it was just me. In the cockpit. Captain Rivera received a new transmission. His brows furrowed as he read the text from ground control. He called back to the cabin through the intercom, his voice calm but measured. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you following events on the news, Atlantic Sky has released an official statement. I'll read it in part. We acknowledge a serious incident of discriminatory behavior on Flight 447. Immediate measures are being taken, including staff suspension, mandatory training, and a review of all frontline practices. We apologize to our passengers and to Mr. Maxwell. Murmurs swept through the rows. Some passengers nodded, others scoffed. The man in 1C muttered, "Damage control. They're just trying to save their skin." Jordan heard him, but he did not answer. He knew the man was partly right. Corporate apologies were currency, cheapened by repetition. But tonight, the apology was tied to a contract and to the eyes of the world. This time, it would carry weight. At headquarters, Robert Kane stood behind a podium in a hastily arranged press room. Bright lights bore down on his pale face. "We failed one of our customers today," he began, "and through that failure, we failed every passenger who expects dignity when they fly with us. Effective immediately, Atlantic Sky is committing to a comprehensive reform program under the guidance of Stratos Systems. We will not tolerate bias in our cabins, at our gates, or in our policies. Not anymore." Journalists hurled questions, but his comms director cut the session short. Robert's eyes lingered on the cameras, knowing every word would be dissected by morning. He thought of Jordan's quiet voice on the phone, the calm precision with which he had dictated demands. For the first time in years, Robert felt the limits of power he once thought unshakable. Back in the air, Marcus Delgado approached Jordan's row. His voice was low, edged with humility. "Mr. Maxwell, I heard the captain read that statement. If they keep their word, if they truly follow through, it'll change everything. But I have to ask, what if they don't?" Jordan's expression did not change. He opened his laptop, tilting the screen so Marcus could see. A single button glowed red, terminate agreement. "If they fail, this stays here," Jordan said quietly. "Not as a threat, as accountability." Marcus swallowed, the truth landing heavy. He nodded once and stepped back, his posture no longer that of an enforcer, but of a man reconsidering his purpose. Clara Jensen lingered nearby, her voice breaking when she finally spoke. "Mr. Maxwell, I've been replaying my words in my head since it happened. I can't believe I said them. I can't believe I thought I had the right. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to learn. I want to do better." Jordan studied her face. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by exposure and consequence. In its place stood raw vulnerability. He spoke softly, but each word was deliberate. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give. Growth is yours to choose. Tonight gave you that chance. What you do with it will decide who you are tomorrow." Her eyes filled with tears she fought to contain. She nodded quickly, pressing her lips together. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of humility strong enough to guide change. Evelyn watched silently, her gaze warm but piercing. She turned toward the young mother, then to the businessman, then to Lily. "You see," she said, "justice is not just one man standing firm. It is all of us recognizing ourselves in him and refusing to look away." Lily's voice trembled as she spoke into her phone again. "I think what she means is, being a witness makes you part of the story. And if you're part of the story, you have to decide what kind of ending you want." Jordan leaned back, finally letting his breath ease. For all the battles left to fight, this was the beginning of something irreversible. He had forced a system to stop, but it was the witnesses who would force it to change. The engines droned steadily, carrying them westward through the night. Somewhere ahead, Los Angeles waited. Somewhere ahead. Negotiations and headlines and boardrooms full of lawyers and executives would try to reframe what had happened. But inside the cabin, truth had already been spoken, and stories had already been shared. Jordan opened his notebook, the one he carried for reflections rather than figures. In a slow, steady hand, he wrote a single line: consequences, opportunity, witnesses. He closed the cover and rested it on his lap. The plane soared on, a vessel not just through air, but through history, carrying voices that had chosen to speak, and one man who had chosen to make sure they would be heard. The captain's voice broke the heavy stillness with the announcement everyone knew would come eventually. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Los Angeles. Local time is 8:42 p.m. Weather is clear. Temperature 72 degrees. Please remain seated as we prepare for landing. The cabin stirred, but the movement felt different than on any other flight. People shifted not just because of descent, but because each of them sensed they were landing into history. Jordan Maxwell adjusted the strap of his watch, his motions deliberate, steady, outwardly calm. Inwardly, he measured every possible step ahead. The negotiations would not wait. The press would be relentless. And Robert Kane, desperate and cornered, would try to find leverage. Jordan replayed the man's voice in his head, nervous, thin under the weight of a crumbling empire. He knew Kane's instinct would be survival, not contrition. Jordan's task was to turn survival into reform. Lily Tran still clutched her phone. Her audience now passed 800,000. Her voice was low, but urgent. We're landing soon. I don't know what's waiting outside, but people in the comments say reporters are already at LAX. They say protesters are gathering, chanting. This flight, it's not just a flight anymore. It's a symbol. The businessman in 3C tugged at his collar, sweat beating along his temple. They'll eat us alive out there, he muttered. The young mother beside him glanced up, her eyes tired but resolute. Maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe the world needs to see it raw. Evelyn Hart folded her shawl across her lap, her gaze resting on Jordan. You're about to walk into fire, she said softly. But fire has two sides. It can destroy, or it can purify. Jordan nodded slightly. Her words matched the rhythm of his own thoughts. He had no intention of being consumed. He would use the fire to burn away the excuses that had sheltered systemic prejudice for far too long. Clara Jensen leaned forward in her jump seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled. Her lips moved, almost a whisper. What will they do to me, cameras? Reporters. My name's already out there. Isn't it David Ortiz? The purser looked at her. His face was drawn with regret. Yes, it's out there. But what matters now is what you do next. If you walk off that plane silent, you'll be remembered only for tonight's failure. If you walk off ready to own it, maybe you'll be remembered for change. Clara swallowed hard. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Jordan's voice carried across the row, calm but piercing. Strength isn't proven in comfort. It's proven when the world is watching. You don't need to erase what happened. You need to transform it. The engines lowered their pitch, the aircraft tilting slightly as it aligned with approach. Through the windows, Los Angeles shimmered with endless lights. A galaxy spilled across the ground. The sight should have been beautiful, but for many in the cabin, it felt like the glow of an arena into which they were about to step. In the Atlantic Sky headquarters, Robert Kane stood in front of a massive screen showing real-time feeds. Outside LAX, protesters chanted, holding signs hastily painted, "Dignity not optional." Seat while black. Consequences now. Satellite vans clustered near the arrival gate, cameras already pointed at the runway. Kane's chief of staff spoke in a hushed voice. "Sir, the crowd's growing. LAPD estimates several thousand by the time we touch down. News anchors are already calling it one of the biggest airport protests in a decade." Kane pressed his palms to the table. "Then we need to control the optics. Arrange a press area. And when Maxwell steps off, I want security close but invisible. He can't look like a prisoner, but he also can't be given free rein." His comms director shook her head. "With respect, sir, you don't control the optics anymore." "He does." Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew it was true. Back on board, Lily's phone buzzed with a flood of comments. She gasped. "Someone tagged me in a clip from Times Square. They're showing our live stream on the big screen. People are watching in New York, London, Tokyo, everywhere." She looked at Jordan, awe spreading across her face. "You didn't just stop an airline. You started a movement." Jordan's expression remained composed, but his chest tightened. He had not wanted fame, only change, yet fame had found him anyway. His task now was to guide it toward purpose before it was swallowed by spectacle. The captain's voice came again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Seatbelts clicked. Trays locked. The rituals of descent unfolded, but none of them masked the tension. Each passenger sat straighter, eyes darting toward the windows, toward the lights waiting below. The young mother whispered to Evelyn, "What if this all fades in a week? What if people move on?" Evelyn's reply was steady. "Then we remind them, over and over, until they can't look away. Change isn't one moment. It's 1,000 reminders stacked until denial collapses." Jordan's fingers tapped his laptop one last time, sending encrypted updates to his team on the ground. Contingency plans were in place, legal teams ready, public statements drafted. But as he closed the lid, he knew none of it would matter if he failed in the next hour. Negotiations weren't only about contracts, they were about culture, about bending the arc of an entire industry. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, the cabin vibrating. Passengers glanced at one another, the sound reminding them they were seconds from impact. Jordan exhaled slowly, centering himself. He thought of his father's words, spoken years ago at the gates of a country club. "Some places will tell you you don't belong. The question is, will you believe them tonight?" His answer would echo far beyond a gate. The tires screeched against the runway, smoke curling in the dark. The plane roared forward, then slowed, the engines reversing with a guttural growl. Inside, hearts thudded in unison. They were here. From the windows, flashes erupted as cameras captured the landing. The protest outside surged, chants audible even through the cabin walls. Security vehicles flanked the aircraft as it taxied. This was no ordinary arrival. This was theater on the world stage. The final announcement rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." No one moved. All eyes fixed on Jordan. Even Clara, pale and trembling, looked to him as if his choice would dictate her own. Jordan slowly rose, his frame casting a shadow into the aisle. He adjusted his jacket, lifted his carry-on, and spoke just loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "Remember what we said tonight. Witnesses carry responsibility. What happens out there belongs to all of us." The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, but hesitated. None wanted to be the first to step into the storm. Evelyn reached for Jordan's arm briefly. "Go on, son. You've carried us this far. Now carry the message farther." Jordan gave her a nod, his composure unbroken. Yet inside, his thoughts swirled. Doubt whispered, would this end in reform or in ruin? Would people twist his act into arrogance? Would the system fight back harder tomorrow? He quieted the doubts with one truth. Silence had never changed anything. Action had. As the cabin door opened, light flooded in. Shouts from the crowd pierced the air. Cameras flashed like lightning. Jordan stepped forward, his shoulders square, his gaze steady. He was not walking off a plane. He was walking into a trial before the world, and he intended to win. The cabin door opened to a roar unlike anything Jordan Maxwell had ever heard at an airport. Protesters outside the glass walls chanted in unison, their voices rising over the mechanical whine of taxiing engines. Cameras flashed in staccato bursts, painting the jet bridge with light. Reporters pressed forward, microphones raised, while security officers tried to keep a narrow path clear. Passengers hesitated, standing in the aisle with bags clutched tightly, as if stepping off meant stepping into history. Evelyn Hart remained seated, her eyes glinting with a quiet pride. "Go on," she whispered, though Jordan didn't need prompting. Jordan walked forward, his carry-on rolling behind him, his posture tall, unhurried. Every camera followed. The chants of the crowd shifted as his figure emerged. Dignity now. Dignity now. He glanced briefly at Lily Tran, who was still streaming live, her phone trembling in her hand. The viewer count scrolled past 1 million. Waiting at the end of the jet bridge stood Robert Kane. The CEO's suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes betrayed sleeplessness. His jaw was set in a smile that failed to hide its fragility. He extended his hand. "Mr. Maxwell." Jordan paused, looking at the hand for a long beat before shaking it. His grip was firm, his eyes unflinching. "Robert." The cameras caught every second. Kane gestured toward a waiting conference room just beyond security. "Let's talk privately." Jordan's voice was even, but carried for the crowd and microphones to hear. "No, Robert. Some conversations belong in the open." A murmur rippled through the protesters. Reporters leaned closer. Kane's smile faltered, but he nodded stiffly. Together, they stepped into the press pen, a cluster of microphones rising like a forest. "Tonight," Jordan began, his tone calm yet commanding, "was never about one seat on one plane. It was about a system that has allowed prejudice to masquerade as policy for too long. I was humiliated not because of a clerical error, but because someone decided I didn't belong. And when I resisted, I was threatened with removal. That is not just an inconvenience. That is a breach of dignity." The crowd hushed, hanging on his words. Kane cleared his throat. "We acknowledge our failure," and Jordan held up a hand. "Acknowledgement is not enough, which is why, before we landed, Robert and I agreed to binding terms. Atlantic Sky will implement 3 reforms, not in theory, but in practice." He lifted a printed document, the ink still fresh. Cameras zoomed in as he read. 1. Immediate suspension of discriminatory staff pending investigation. 2. Mandatory unconscious bias training for all frontline employees within 60 days, with measurable evaluation. 3. An independent reporting system that cannot be buried in bureaucracy. These are signed commitments. Gasps spread through the press as camera flashes exploded. Reporters shouted over each other, "Mr. Kane, do you confirm?" Robert's voice wavered, but he forced steadiness. "Yes, Atlantic Sky is committed to all 3 measures. This company will change." The chants outside swelled. Change, change, change. Clara Jensen stood just behind the press line, pale but visible. She knew her name was already out there, tied to the humiliation of Jordan Maxwell. As reporters swung cameras toward her, she swallowed hard, then stepped forward. "I was the one who told Mr. Maxwell he didn't belong. I was wrong. I let my assumptions dictate my actions, and tonight I've learned how much harm a moment of bias can cause. I will take the training. I will do the work. And I will spend the rest of my career making sure no one else experiences what I inflicted." Her voice cracked, but it rang with sincerity. A hush followed, then scattered applause broke out among protesters. Evelyn, watching from the edge, smiled faintly. Jordan turned back to the microphones. What Clara just did is what this movement requires. Consequences, yes, but also opportunity to face what was broken and to repair it. If we only punish, we create fear. If we only excuse, we enable. True justice is both accountability and transformation. The elderly woman's words seem to drift across the terminal. Fire can destroy, or it can purify. Reporters fired more questions. Mr. Maxwell, are you satisfied? Will you drop the threat to terminate the contract? Do you plan to expand reforms beyond Atlantic Sky? Jordan's gaze was steady, his tone unhurried. Satisfaction isn't the point. This isn't about me. It's about every passenger who has ever been told, in ways subtle or blatant, that they don't belong. As for the contract, compliance will decide that. If these reforms fail, if commitments break, Stratos Systems retains the right to terminate. That button will not disappear. Gasps again. Protesters roared approval. Hashtags trended in real time. Jared Dignity Clause. Witness for change. Seat while black. Kane stood stiff, the weight of public accountability pressing down like gravity. Yet, deep inside, he felt something shift. Maybe survival could mean more than just protecting profits. Maybe it could mean rebuilding trust. Jordan glanced toward Lily. You streamed this, and the world became witness. That's the power of refusing to stay silent. Every person watching tonight now carries a piece of responsibility. Change doesn't live in contracts or boardrooms alone. It lives in people who refuse to let injustice pass unseen. Tears welled in Lily's eyes. She turned the camera back toward herself and whispered, "We're not just watching anymore. We're part of it." As the press frenzy continued, passengers filtered past, some giving Jordan nods of gratitude, others stopping to speak. The businessman from 3C approached, his voice low. "Mr. Maxwell, I owe you an apology. I wanted them to drag you off so we could take off. I was wrong. You taught me what matters more than schedules." Jordan looked at him, eyes steady. "Remember that lesson next time someone else is in my seat." The man nodded, humbled, and stepped away. Marcus Delgado, the security officer, approached next. His posture was less rigid than before, his voice softer. "You showed me that following the script isn't always justice. I'll carry that." Jordan inclined his head. "Then carry it well. Authority is heavy. Use it with care." At the edge of the crowd, Evelyn Hart closed her eyes briefly, savoring the sound of chants rising, the sight of young people holding signs, the knowledge that she had lived to see such a moment. Her whisper carried only to herself. "This is what I waited 50 years for." The press conference wound down, but the movement it sparked did not. Overnight, footage of Jordan's calm defiance, Clara's public admission, and Kane's reluctant pledge swept across screens worldwide. By morning, governments and corporations alike were fielding questions about their own policies. By the end of the week, other airlines announced reviews of bias protocols. Within months, industries beyond aviation began adopting similar reforms. In Los Angeles, Jordan sat in his office at Stratos Systems reviewing a report. Complaints of bias in Atlantic Sky's hubs had dropped 68% in 3 months. Training completion was at 95%. The independent reporting system logged cases in real time, forcing leadership to respond. Change was not perfect, but it was measurable. Rachel, his assistant, placed an envelope on his desk from Clara. Jordan opened it, finding a handwritten note. "Mr. Maxwell, I've begun leading the training program. Every session reminds me of what I almost destroyed and of the chance you gave me to rebuild. I won't waste it." Jordan folded the letter carefully, placing it beside the report. His gaze drifted to the city skyline, lights glowing like stars. He thought of Evelyn, of Lily, of Marcus, of passengers whose stories had spilled into the cabin that night. One flight, one confrontation had turned into a ripple stretching across industries and borders. Later, at a civil rights conference in Washington, Jordan stood before thousands. Behind him, 3 words glowed on a massive screen: consequences, opportunity, witnesses. He spoke quietly, but every word carried. Justice isn't outrage alone. It's action. It's consequences that hold systems accountable, opportunities that allow people to change, and witnesses who refuse to be silent. 6 months ago, I was told I didn't belong in a seat I had paid for. Tonight, I tell you, dignity belongs to all of us, and some stories must be told in the open, because only when the world is watching does the world change. Applause thundered, rolling like a wave. Lily streamed it live, her audience now in the millions. Evelyn, seated in the front row, wiped a tear. Clara stood beside David, ready to lead the next wave of training, and Robert Kane, somewhere backstage, listened with a heart heavier yet clearer than before. Jordan ended simply. The question for each of us is this: when the moment comes, will you be a spectator, or will you be a witness who sparks change? The hall erupted, but Jordan remained still, his voice quiet in his own mind. He had not sought this role, but he had accepted it, because silence had never been an option. Tonight, you witnessed more than a clash over a single seat. You witnessed how prejudice can humiliate in seconds, and how dignity, when defended with clarity and calm, can change entire systems. Jordan Maxwell didn't choose anger. He chose action. He demanded consequences, but also offered opportunity. He reminded the world that justice is not revenge, and silence is not an option. In that cabin, witnesses were born, and through them, change began to spread across companies, across industries, across lives. But this story leaves us with questions we cannot escape. How many times have we seen injustice and looked away? How many times have we chosen convenience over courage? And when the next moment comes, at an airport, in a hotel, on a street corner, will we stay silent? Or will we speak as you reflect? Hold both love and outrage in your heart. Love for the strength it takes to stand with dignity. Outrage for the cruelty of discrimination that still lingers. And let that mix move you to action. Because the fight for justice doesn't end with Jordan's story. It continues with you. If this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe, and join us for the next story that demands to be told.